I challenged my wealthiest, most arrogant neighbor to a winner-takes-all horse race to finally settle a boundary dispute neither of our families could afford to keep fighting. Certain his superior horses would beat mine easily, and considering the near-certain loss simply the fastest available way to force a resolution the county's slow legal channels couldn't provide quickly enough to save my dying herd. Halfway down that final stretch, watching him hold his own horse back rather than pass me, I understood he was losing on purpose, and I had no idea why. My name is Willa Bragg, and I was 26 years old that summer, running my father's 400 acres of Texas hill country alone since his death 2 years before. Land that shared its most reliable water source, a modest creek running through disputed territory, with a considerably larger Sinclair spread belonging to Beauregard Sinclair and his elderly father Augustus. My father had built this ranch from a modest starter claim over 30 years, raising me alone after my mother's death when I was young, teaching me everything he knew about cattle and land and the particular stubborn patience frontier ranching required, lessons I had drawn on considerably these past 2 years managing alone what had once required both his experience and my own developing capability working together. The particular boundary dispute over that creek's exact property line had simmered between our two families for over 20 years, originating in some falling out between my father and old Augustus Sinclair that neither man had ever properly explained to either of their children, a grudge inherited rather than genuinely understood by either Beau or myself. I had asked my father about it directly, more than once during his lifetime, and had received only vague, deflecting answers about pride and old business that he clearly preferred not properly revisiting, leaving me, after his death, with a dispute I had inherited without ever understanding its actual origins. If I lost that race, I stood to lose considerably more than simple pride. I stood to lose access to the only reliable water source my dying herd had any hope of surviving that particular summer's brutal drought on, since the Sinclair family's considerably larger legal resources had, over the preceding months, gradually pressed their claim to the creek's disputed section through a slow formal survey process my own modest finances couldn't properly match or contest through equivalent legal representation. I had already sold off nearly a third of my remaining herd that spring, simply to afford enough hay to keep the remainder alive through a drought considerably worse than any I had personally witnessed in my 26 years on that particular stretch of Texas hill country. A public race, witnessed by the whole county at that summer's harvest gathering, offered the one available path toward a resolution considerably faster than the formal survey's continued delays, whatever the considerable risk of losing outright to a man whose horses had never once in living memory lost a fair race to anyone in our county. I proposed the wager to Beau directly, in front of a considerable crowd gathered for the county's annual summer social, understanding that a public challenge, witnessed broadly enough, would carry the particular social weight that made backing out afterward considerably more costly than simply accepting and racing properly. I had spent several days beforehand carefully and thoroughly considering exactly how and when to make this particular proposal, understanding that timing and public witness mattered as much as the wager's actual terms in ensuring Beau couldn't simply dismiss it privately without the county noticing. I'm proposing we settle this creek dispute the way our fathers apparently never managed to, I told him, loud enough for the gathered crowd to properly hear. One race, my horse against yours, winner takes the disputed section outright, formally surveyed and filed the following week regardless of what either family's lawyers have argued previously. I watched several nearby conversations pause entirely as word of the challenge spread quickly through the gathering, the particular considerable interest a public dispute always generated in a county with genuinely limited entertainment options. Beau studied me a long moment, and I want to record that something in his expression, underneath the particular confident amusement I expected from a man being challenged to a contest he seemed certain to win easily, struck me as considerably more complicated than simple arrogance. "You're proposing to risk your entire remaining water access on a single race," he said, "against horses that have never lost to anyone in this county. I'd ask you to reconsider, Miss Bragg, not out of any particular desire to see you humiliated, but out of genuine concern for what losing would actually cost your operation." "I appreciate the concern," I said, with considerably more edge than genuine appreciation, though I'd point out that your family's slow legal maneuvering is already costing my operation considerably more than an honest race would risk. I'd rather lose cleanly and quickly than watch my herd die of thirst while lawyers argue survey boundaries for another full season. Beau accepted the challenge that afternoon, with the particular formal seriousness the public setting required, and I want to record that Otis Crabtree, his longtime foreman standing nearby, made no particular effort to hide his own visible confusion at his employer's evident willingness to risk anything at all on a contest Sinclair horses were expected to win as a simple matter of course. The race itself was set for the following Saturday, a considerable stretch of open country between our two properties that both families knew intimately. 3 miles of mixed terrain that would properly test both horse and rider, rather than simply favoring whichever animal possessed the fastest raw speed on level ground. I spent that week preparing my own horse, a capable but unremarkable gelding named Ranger, with the particular focused intensity of a woman who understood exactly how much rode on a single Saturday afternoon's performance. I walked the entire 3-mile course twice that week, memorizing every rise and creek crossing and patch of loose stone that might affect Ranger's footing, understanding that whatever advantage I could claim through careful preparation and genuine knowledge of our shared terrain represented my only realistic counter to the Sinclair horse's superior breeding and training. I want to record what actually happened during that race as plainly and accurately as I properly can, because the specific sequence of events is the whole of what eventually required Beau's own explanation. We started evenly matched through the first mile, Beau's considerably finer horse pulling ahead gradually as the terrain opened into flatter ground, exactly the outcome I had expected and privately prepared myself to accept with whatever grace I could manage. I remember watching that gap widen with a particular resigned clarity, understanding my own horse's honest limitations against genuinely superior Sinclair breeding, and beginning, somewhere in that second mile, to properly prepare myself for the considerable disappointment of a loss I had known from the outset was the statistically likely outcome, rehearsing in my own mind the particular gracious acceptance I intended to manage regardless of how genuinely it cost me. Then, somewhere in the race's final mile, approaching the creek crossing that marked the course's most technically demanding stretch, I noticed Beau's horse inexplicably easing rather than pressing the considerable lead he'd built, a hesitation that made no sense from a rider and horse both fully capable of maintaining or extending that advantage through the crossing. I crossed that creek perhaps 2 lengths ahead of him, an advantage I had not properly earned through my own horse's genuine superior speed, and I understood, watching him deliberately hold his own mount back through the final stretch, rather than making any genuine effort to reclaim the lead, that Beauregard Sinclair had thrown the race entirely, allowing me to win a contest his own horse could have easily taken. I confronted him directly, immediately after crossing the finish line to the crowd's considerable cheering, before either of us had properly dismounted. "You held your horse back," I said, keeping my voice low enough that only Beau could properly hear it beneath the crowd's continued celebration. "Deliberately, through that entire final stretch. I want to understand why, Beau, before I accept a victory I apparently didn't actually earn." My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly on the reins, the particular adrenaline of the race itself compounding with the considerable new confusion of understanding my apparent triumph had not been genuinely won. Beau was quiet a long moment, and I watched him do the particular difficult work of a man deciding whether to maintain a convenient fiction or finally explain something he had clearly not intended to reveal so directly. "I'd ask you to accept the win regardless," he said finally, "and let the explanation wait for somewhere considerably more private than the middle of a cheering crowd." His voice carried a particular careful steadiness that told me, even before he'd properly explained anything, that whatever reason lay behind his decision was genuinely considered rather than any careless impulse. I want to explain, plainly, what Beau eventually told me that evening, once we'd found genuine privacy away from the gathering's continued celebration, because understanding it properly is the whole of what this entire strange contest actually turned out to be about. The original falling out between our fathers, Beau explained, had stemmed from a broken business partnership decades before, my father and Augustus Sinclair having once planned to develop that same creek's water rights jointly before some considerable disagreement over the actual terms left both men bitter and estranged. A bitterness Augustus had apparently nursed for over 20 years, with a stubbornness that had gradually transformed a simple business dispute into something considerably more personal. Beau explained that the details of the original disagreement remained genuinely murky even within his own family, his father having never properly discussed the specifics even with his own son, leaving Beau to piece together only fragments of the actual grievance from occasional bitter remarks over the years. "My father has never properly let go of that original grievance," Beau told me, "whatever the actual facts of the original disagreement genuinely were, and I've watched him spend 2 decades treating your family's modest claim to that creek as some ongoing referendum on his own wounded pride rather than a simple practical matter that could have been resolved fairly years ago, with considerably less cost to both families. I've disagreed with his position privately for years, Willa, but I've never found a way to properly act on that disagreement without seeming to publicly betray my own father's authority." He paused, looking out at the darkening evening sky rather than at me. "I've watched that particular grudge cost your family considerably more than it ever genuinely cost mine, and I've carried a certain private guilt about that imbalance for longer than I've properly admitted, even to myself. And the race gave you that opportunity, I said, working through the considerable implications of what Bo was describing. It did, Bo said. I could not simply concede the water rights outright without directly contradicting my father in a manner I understood would cause considerable family strain I wasn't certain either of us could properly weather. But I could lose a fair, publicly witnessed race, Willa, in a manner nobody could properly accuse of being anything other than simple bad luck or a horse having an off day. I chose to lose deliberately because it was the only path I could find toward giving you what genuine fairness required without forcing an open confrontation with my own father that I wasn't certain would resolve in your favor even if I won that particular argument. I sat with this considerable explanation a long moment, understanding, slowly, that Bo's apparent arrogance these past years had actually concealed a genuinely difficult private position, caught between his own father's inherited bitterness and what Bo himself apparently believed was simple fairness toward a neighbor his family had wronged decades before either of us were old enough to properly understand the original dispute. There's something else, Bo said, when I did not immediately respond, that I should probably explain as well, given how much I've already revealed this evening. He looked at me directly, in a way he generally didn't allow himself around me, the particular careful vulnerability of a man setting aside considerable pride. I've admired you for several years now, Willa. Watching you manage that ranch alone with a competence and stubbornness I found considerably more compelling than I ever properly admitted, even to myself. I understood, however, that courting you openly would have required directly confronting my father's particular grudge in a manner I wasn't prepared to manage until this race finally gave me a path toward resolving the practical dispute first. He paused, studying his own hands rather than my face, the particular posture of a man uncertain how his confession would actually land. I want to be honest that the race was not purely selfless generosity on my part, Willa. I recognized, planning it, that losing deliberately would give me both the practical resolution I believed was owed to your family and, I confess, a reasonable pretext for finally speaking with you privately about matters that had very little to do with creek boundaries at all. I want to record that I did not immediately know how to properly respond to this additional revelation, understanding that the considerable weight of everything Bo had confessed that evening extended well beyond simple sportsmanship into something considerably more personal than I had properly prepared myself to process in one single overwhelming conversation. I found myself standing there in the fading evening light, turning over several years of my own assumptions about Bo's supposed arrogance, understanding now that what I had generally read as simple confident dismissiveness had actually concealed a man carefully, deliberately holding himself back from something he genuinely wanted, in ways considerably more complicated than I had ever properly credited him with managing. The confrontation with Augustus Sinclair came the following week, when Bo formally informed his father that the creek's disputed section would be surveyed and filed according to the race's outcome. A conversation Bo insisted on having directly rather than through intermediaries, understanding that finally properly confronting his father's decades-old grievance required his own genuine presence rather than continued avoidance. "You've thrown away 20 years of careful legal positioning," Augustus said when I arrived, at Bo's own invitation, to witness this particular difficult family conversation. "Over a horse race you deliberately lost, Beauregard, for reasons I confess I find considerably harder to properly respect than simple foolishness would at least explain. I've spent 2 decades protecting this family's proper standing in this county, and I'll not pretend I understand why you've chosen to unwind that careful work over a single afternoon's misplaced sentiment. I threw away 20 years of a grudge that was never properly yours to hold against people who had no part in whatever actually happened between you and Thomas Bragg decades ago," Bo said, with a directness toward his own father I had not previously witnessed him manage. "I've watched you nurse that particular bitterness for my entire adult life, Father, and I've concluded, finally, that I'm not prepared to inherit it any further simply out of filial obligation to a dispute I don't properly understand and don't believe either you or Thomas Bragg's own daughter genuinely benefits from continuing." He held his father's gaze steadily, the particular controlled resolve of a man who had clearly rehearsed this exact confrontation many times in his own mind before finally managing to deliver it plainly. Augustus was quiet a long moment, studying his son with an expression I could not properly read, some complicated combination of anger and, underneath it, something that might have been grudging respect. "Your mother would have said something similar," he said finally, "had she lived long enough to watch this particular grievance calcify as thoroughly as it apparently has. I'll not pretend to properly understand your reasoning, Beauregard, but I'll not stand in the way of it either, whatever private reservations I continue to hold. He looked toward me directly for the first time since I'd entered the room, his cold, pale eyes carrying something considerably more complicated than simple hostility. "I owed your father a proper apology decades ago, Miss Bragg, that my own pride never permitted me to properly deliver. I'll not manage it fully today either, but I'll acknowledge, at minimum, that my son's judgment on this particular matter appears considerably sounder than my own has been." The creek's disputed section was formally surveyed and filed under Bragg family ownership within the month, resolving a boundary dispute that had genuinely outlasted whatever original grievance had first created it. And I want to record that the particular relief of finally securing reliable water access for my herd was considerably complicated that autumn by the equally considerable complication of properly navigating whatever had actually developed between Bo and myself over the course of that single revealing evening's conversation. The county surveyor who finally completed the formal filing remarked, "I later heard that it was the most straightforward boundary resolution he'd managed in years, entirely unaware of the considerable emotional complexity that had actually produced such a simple final outcome." "I don't require anything further from you," Bo told me, some weeks later, both of us sitting on my own ranch house porch in a conversation that had become, since the race, a considerably more frequent occurrence than either of us had properly acknowledged. "I settled the water dispute because it was genuinely owed to your family, regardless of whatever else might or might not eventually develop between us. I'd simply ask that you not feel any particular obligation toward me on account of it, whatever admission I made that evening about my own longer private feelings." He looked out at the creek, now flowing freely and fairly onto Bragg land, the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally set right something that had troubled him considerably longer than he'd properly admitted to anyone. "I don't feel obligated," I said, "though I confess I've spent these past weeks considerably more interested in your continued company than simple gratitude for a resolved water dispute generally requires. I find myself wondering, Bo, whether you'd finally consider courting me properly, now that your father's particular grievance no longer stands directly between us." I watched something considerable shift across his face at that question, the particular careful hope of a man who had genuinely not expected to hear exactly those words spoken so plainly. We were married the following spring, in a small ceremony that combined both families' modest remaining relations, Augustus attending with the particular grudging but genuine goodwill of a man who had, over the intervening months, come to properly accept his son's decision, even without fully abandoning his own private reservations about the original dispute's history. He surprised us both, that wedding day, with a small formal gift of a portion of Sinclair grazing land adjoining the disputed creek, a gesture he offered without much explanation beyond the observation that a properly combined operation deserved proper resources to manage it well. The closest thing to an actual apology either Bo or I ever heard him offer regarding the original two-decade dispute, still faintly scandalized by the whole affair years later. Never fully stopped bringing up the race at family gatherings, generally concluding the retelling with the observation that he'd never in 30 years of service seen a Sinclair horse deliberately lose a fair contest, and didn't expect to see it happen again regardless of how many more years he continued working that particular ranch. He took a particular pride, I came to understand, in having witnessed what he considered the single strangest and most consequential horse race the county had seen in his considerable memory. A story he told with slightly different embellishments each time, depending on his audience and how much cider had been served at whatever gathering prompted the retelling. I still keep Ranger, the gelding who carried me across that creek 2 lengths ahead of a horse considerably faster than his own honest capability, in a comfortable retirement in our combined pastures now. And some evenings, watching Bo work our joined land with the same careful attention he once brought to a race he'd deliberately thrown. I understand more clearly each year that the truest victories sometimes require a man's willingness to lose plainly, publicly, and completely, simply because winning would have cost considerably more than the race itself was ever actually worth. A lesson I suspect neither of our fathers ever properly learned in their own considerably longer years of stubborn disagreement.